All right, guys. So with the first kind of demo here and working in Blender, we're going to look at the interface, how it's sort of outlined, where to find things, how to adjust preferences inside the interface, knowing basic panels and tools that you will likely focus on using when working with and designing your models. So let's get started with looking at some of the basic areas in here and just kind of outlining them real quick. The overall look of the interface on the front end is fairly basic, not all that unusual from what we've experienced with Photoshop or Illustrator. We have a main working area in the center of the screen. In Blender, this is called the scene, which is very common for 3D software for that to be called the scene, which is the main working area for modeling and shaping and building. And then usually surrounding that area are all of our panels and tools for working inside of the environment. Now Blender has, like, for the most part, a lot of parts of Blender mirror what you can find in other 3D software that's out there, or professional grade software that's out there. It has a lot of simple tools, and then there are also a lot of advanced tools floating in here. So let's break down the interface piece by piece. So first up, let's look at the top. You'll notice that there's a top bar that runs up here, and it has a little icon in the corner that looks like an eye in a circle. Each area inside of Blender, each panel is denoted with one of these little icons. So if you look all around the interface, you'll probably see more icons in the corner of each panel. So there's one over here, there's one down here, there's another one at the very bottom, there's one over here, and also over here. What's interesting about the Blender interface, guys, is that it's completely flexible with the way that it's designed. So I can actually take any one of these panels and I can click on the icon in the representative corner for it, and I can change it to a completely different panel in this list right here. So again, if you have a panel you're not really using, you could just switch it to something you are using. That's one way that the interface works. Another one is sort of the flexibility of the panel shapes. You can also resize by moving your mouse around the outskirt edges of a panel to widen it to see all the details, especially on this side of the screen. You can also move between panels. If there's a break between them, you can also reshape or resize those as well. And another feature that's in here that usually gets people thrown off from the get-go in the software is this little icon in the corner of most of your panel areas. There's this little triangulated sort of corner line that you'll find in different places throughout the interface. If you click on that little corner, it'll show you a plus sign with your mouse. If you click and drag, what it does is it pulls out an exact duplicate of that panel that it's connected to. Now, the one thing about this, it looks cool, but it can actually ruin your experience with Blender like instantly. Because there's no way to just turn off a panel easily. There's no X button. So here's how you fix it. If you drag out a copy like that, which you can do, but if you want to get rid of the copy, what I suggest doing is coming over here to the original, move your mouse over that plus sign, and click and drag towards the copy, and you'll see a giant arrow appear on screen, and then let go. And what that does is that actually it just takes that one panel and overlaps the next door panel, okay? So again, if you get stuck where you've added a panel, you can just go back up into the corner and drag it back towards the other panel that you duplicated, and it will remove it. What's up?
She made like...
Okay, so she made like 5 or 6 panels? Yeah.
Oh wait, I did it.
Great job. There you go. Okay, she fixed it. Okay, so that's just kind of understanding the panel. Yes?
What would be a good benefit of using that?
Yeah, so a lot of people will use this, like especially with this big viewport area, they will duplicate it to actually have access to all of these same controls in multiple screens. So let me show you. Like, there's a few ways that you can do this in the software. My screen is really tiny, so I'll try. But what this gives you the benefit of is that I can actually control a viewport over here that I can do things with visually to adjust the view that won't affect this side. So what that means is that I can also change the way that this side is shaded independently of this side. So if I want to see a wireframe view on this side, I can do it very easily by having two ports open. That's an immediate benefit to doing this. Yeah, otherwise you're just cluttering up your interface and things will go crazy very quickly. So that's why I recommend, like, again, for starting out, it's much easier to work with one. Because we'll also work with how to break this into 4 views using a special tool called Quad View instead. All right. So that's just a couple things with that part. There's one panel in here we are absolutely not going to touch, which is the animation timeline at the very bottom of your screen. That's this guy down here, if I can grab it and move it. Yeah. See this strip down here at the bottom? If I can move this out of the way. This strip down at the bottom is totally unnecessary for what we'll be doing. So to get rid of it, we do it the same way we did before. Find the little corner triangles in that animation region down below, which will usually be over towards the right. And you're going to click and drag upwards. Actually, I take that back. Don't do that. Click and drag downwards. Yeah. That's okay. If you did it backwards, if you did it backwards, that's okay. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can do besides dragging out more panels, trying to fix it. If you messed it up and you have multiple panels now that look like this, right? Or you have just one that looks like the timeline. What you can do is switch that timeline panel in the bottom corner, the bottom left corner. Click on that icon that looks like a clock, and then switch it to 3D view. And that will convert it over to your 3D view instead of a timeline. Yeah, now half of it is because you have another timeline on there. Well, sort of. Yeah, you got to drag up from the one below.
I keep making.
No, don't go that way. This is a great demo. This is a good demo for this.
Oh
Yeah, so you
my
want to pull it the other way.
Oh.
Upwards. Upwards. Yeah. See that? There you go. Okay, you're safer now.
Wait, I still.
If you still have a duplicate, don't worry. It won't end the experience yet. Okay. So I just dropped out the timeline because it's really not necessary for what we're doing in here, because we're not going to be animating in this project. As cool as that would be. But we have other things we need to focus on. So that being said, that's how the flexibility of the interface sort of works. Let's go ahead and break down panel to panel here. The top toolbar that you see that goes across your screen starts off with your file, your basic file menu. Underneath here you can do all your opening, saving, importing and exporting, as well as changing preferences inside of Blender, which we'll do here in a little bit to kind of show you like options that you can change for your benefit. Other things you can access from this toolbar at the top, there's a render function. This is a special term used in film, video, and animation called render, which basically is a method for creating and simulating a final image frame or collection of frames for an animation or video. So it renders or it creates fully stylized and photographic quality like shadow representation, lighting effects, and texture effects, which we'll use at the end of the project. All right, now skip over to, there's an area over here on the top bar. Like, I wish my bar could show all of it, but the projector's kind of goofy, so I'll just kind of fake it here for a second. This long string of black text up here at the top, all of that information tells you information based on the object you have selected. So right now, what you have selected is a cube, and it tells me up here that it measures the vertices, which is verts, the faces, the triangles, the objects represented in the scene, the number of lamps, and how much memory it's taking up, plus the name of the object at the end, which says cube. But this is a quick way to identify how dense your object is that you're working on. So you'll know right away if your computer's slowing down, you can probably select that object and find out that it's the object causing it, right? If it has lots of polygons, it's going to tell you up here at the top. And again, that's something that's good to note as you work, but it'll become more important as we get to the end of the project. Okay, so that's the top toolbar. I'm not going to really go over much more up there, except for that part. Over here on the left side of the screen, we have what's called a tool shelf. And the tool shelf is made up of commonly used tools in the interface. Sometimes extension tools are added over here. And they're each represented by different tabs according to their function. So there's a lot of tools stored over here that we'll get to play with and learn to use today. Again, I'm not going to go over all of them yet. We'll cover that in a minute. But that's where you can find them now. This is a context-sensitive tool shelf, so it changes when you change out modes inside of Blender for editing purposes. So right now we're in basic object mode, so it looks like this. All right, so that's that side of the screen. Now look across the bottom. At the bottom, you should have a toolbar that looks like mine. This is your 3D menu at the bottom. And this menu actually affects your viewport and the toolbar over here on the side. So if this changes modes down here, then everything else will change accordingly. So let's look at this toolbar for the 3D menu. So I'm going to break this one down into pieces. So the first one is View. Under View, you will find basic options for changing your methods of viewing inside of Blender. So at the bottom, it's got things like switching to a right side view versus a front view. We can also use zoom tools in here, like zooming into with a border shape around the screen that you can click and drag out. You can also zoom in and out of your screen with plus or minus on your keyboard, by the way. There's also options at the very top of the view area, one that I want you to pay attention to called Toggle Quad View, which I'm going to go ahead and turn on. If you want to, go ahead and turn that on too so you can see the effect of it. So go up to the top of View and hit Toggle Quad View. And your viewport area will break up into a 4-square grid. And I want to identify this because this is a tool you will use a lot inside of 3D software. It is the best way for editing a shape or a form or a collection to help line them up accurately. Now, we previewed this in the lecture material from last week, like what 3D programs often use for their interface. One of them was a 4-part camera view system. Now in Blender, it has it broken apart into 4 specific parts that are each labeled. So if you look on screen, you can see each one has a different title. The first one is the top ortho. Ortho means orthographic, by the way. That means flat perspective. No vanishing point, no distortion. Then there's the front angle. We have a right side view, and then we have a user perspective window that you can kind of manipulate and change as you see fit. But the other ones stay locked in to flat perspectives.
I somehow accidentally switched my user perspective to where it looks like the top ortho.
If you did that for top orthographic, oh, like where you hit like one of the shortcut keys, you probably did that is what happened.
Okay.
If you hit a shortcut key, like your number pad, for those of you on a full-size keyboard, and in our classroom we have those, your number pad keys, like 0 through 9, all change your viewports, will change your user viewport setting. So if you hit 0, it will switch to your camera perspective. If you hit, if you turn, you can also turn that off by hitting 0 again.
Sir,
Yeah,
I don't know, my mouse is stuck in.
yeah. You probably need to hit escape. There you go. You can also use 4 and 6 to rotate your scene, and you can also use 8
Oh,
and 5, or 8 and 2. My bad.
it disappeared.
What did?
The square disappeared.
Yep. You probably made it invisible by accident.
Yeah, I don't know how I did it.
So you can use the number pad keys to switch things like this on screen. So whether it's rotating it like incrementally left and right, up and down. You can also use the other number pad keys, like 7 puts you in a top perspective automatically, 9 is the bottom point of view, 1 is front, and 3 is right. And then you can just use the other keys, like again 4, 8, 6, or 2 to kind of manually orbit around the imagery.
Sorry, I think if there's an error. When I press 2, it goes away.
Now you're on the number pad, right over there on the far side of the keyboard.
No, I tried that too. That just doesn't. Oh, okay, now it does.
Yeah, if you press 2 on the numbers that go across the top of your keyboard, that will actually switch what's called layers inside of 3D modeling. The only way, if you want to turn it back on, you come down here to the bottom of your 3D panel or 3D menu, and there's this little collection of gray grid squares. If you're not selected on the little gray grid square that shows a little orange circle in it, then you're in an empty layer, and that's when there's nothing visible on screen. So make sure you're in that first little square there to make sure that you're in the right layer area. Okay. So that's just navigating around this the viewport. Other things I want you to notice about the grid is that you also have a few other things represented out here. Number one, we have a ground plane represented that your object rests in. That's basically a representation of ground inside of 3D software. So you have some anchor. Otherwise, you're just kind of floating around in never-ending 3D space. But that's what the grid represents. The blue, red, and green pop-up that you're seeing on your selected object, that is called a 3D axis or widget or 3D widget. And the widget actually allows you to do on-screen manipulation of your object. So you can click on the arrows to move your object along that axis. In this case, we're moving the object. We'll change settings in a minute for rotation and scale. But for now, by default, it's set to move or grab. You can also, to manipulate that, you can also click in the inside of the little inner white circle that appears between the 3 intersecting locations of those arrows so that you can just kind of free move your object around the screen. Blender is sensitive to where you click and do things. So if you click inside of one perspective view as opposed to another, it's going to rotate completely differently in all the other 4 views. So if I go to my top and rotate, it rotates on a 2D axis inside that view only. See that? Looks kind of wild in all the other 4 views, right? So that's what's going on there. So it is context sensitive to how you move things and where you click.
Why can you create a monkey?
That I'll explain later.
Okay.
So that's working inside of View. Let's go back down to that 3D menu again at the bottom. And the next one up is Select. This is a basic for just making selection of objects inside of your scene. So there's basic things we can do here, like we can use a paintbrush tool called Circle Select to actually paint over objects we can see. So if I turn on Circle and come out into my viewports, I can actually paint directly over objects to add them all to a single selection together. Blender will let you know that an object is selected by highlighting it or outlining it in orange, by the way. So if you're ever wondering what object is selected, just look inside your viewport and see what's outlined orange. Or you can also check other areas, which we'll look at in a minute. But that's one way to notice. If you paint with the selection tool, by the way, you have to disengage it to get off of it, which you do by hitting escape. Otherwise, you can't do anything else in Blender. You're stuck. But then I have all my objects selected, and I can now move all of them at the same time. All right. If you don't want everything selected, you can hit A to deselect everything, or you can hit A again to select all. Just a little shortcut there. The next menu is called Add. If you click on Add, this is where you can actually do what it says, add more things to your scene. Standard shapes, other forms, tools into your scene. So if you look under Add, you've got all kinds of things from meshes, which are object models, curves, which are basically like vector pathways. You can actually design with vectors and then create 3D objects from them in here. Pretty cool. Surfaces, these are called NURBS. It's kind of a funny name, right? But they give you kind of on-screen controllers for manipulating their form. Metaballs, these are kind of fun. You can drop in text. You can also drop in lamps, which are light sources into your scene, or cameras. So there's lots of little things that you can use the Add menu to drop into your scene automatically to work with. The last little menu option in here is one called Object. And under Object, you have access to things like your undo buttons, transform controls, which are very important. If you look under transform, there are options like grab, rotate, and scale. Those are your basic transforms. Grab is just another word for move, which they use in here interchangeably. They also use the word translate to interject with the word move. But just so you understand, you're just moving things around with that tool. So up, down, left, right, or back and forth in space. So there's different things like that listed under Object. You also have options for duplicating objects inside here. You also have a couple options for quick effects, which are kind of fun, like how to quickly explode an object or quickly give it fur and those types of things. All right, let's keep sliding through this menu down here. Next up, this is your button for object mode. So these are your modes you can change. It's represented by a cube icon or an orange cube. Go ahead and click on that so you can see into it. There are, with a single object selected, you can actually have access to 6 different modes available in Blender. The basic one is object, so that's when you're just moving things around inside the scene. If you want to get more nitty-gritty on editing, you could use edit mode to be very specific about settings or positions of polygons that you want to change, delete, and extend. And the other one that we'll probably work with a lot will also be sculpt mode. That mode is one where you can actually work with your model in such a way to be able to sculpt it like a sculptor does with clay. A lot of fun, very organic, and fairly intuitive to work with. So that's your modes. Now if you switch, let's just do this just for fun so you can see it. Go ahead and switch to edit mode. And when you do that, notice how your menus change ever so slightly. Your tool shelf has converted. It has different tools listed now. And even your menu bar at the bottom, your 3D menu bar, has some different options. Your select menu now has tons of stuff listed under it. You have a mesh menu now, which is different. It used to be object while we were in object mode. You still have the add mode. but you have a lot of things under mesh that you can also change. Again, we'll review those later. But just so you're aware, menus change whenever you switch modes. There's even more icons across the bottom for the edit mode specifically. All right, so switch back to object now. Object mode. The next icon over is a white sphere. This is your shader settings. This is for how it represents objects inside of Blender, visualizes objects in Blender. So you get 6 different settings that you can play with. And each one does something different to an object. If you click through and go through them, you'll see very quickly. Bounding box uses a representational hollowed out box to show where an object is located. It also shows the outer boundary limits of that object. So if it was a sphere, it would still show a rectangle or a cube for its placeholder shape. People often use that in 3D software to keep the system from bogging down when you're just moving objects, so that you're not moving an entire mesh structure that might be really dense in detail. The next one is wireframe. Now, with a cube on screen, wireframe and bounding box don't look different at all because it's a cube. There's nothing real fancy about a cube. But if you had a sphere on screen, and I'll just add one for kicks here. If you have a sphere on your screen, you could change it. Right now it shows it in wireframe on my screen, but if I switch it back to bounding box, it shows a box for the sphere, right? So wireframe gives it a skeleton, so we understand what the object looks like underneath. Solid will wrap a skin around the skeleton. If you keep going up, they've got ones called texture, which will actually simulate an image texture on your object if you have one wrapped around it. Material will show the base color of the object, or shine, or other attributes. And rendered will show you an actual sort of preview photorealistic rendering of the scene based on the settings you already have rigged from just from the windows. Now, rendered does not give you access to the basic on-screen controls, like your little widget disappears. You can't tell which object is visually selected. It's just for previewing. It's not for editing it, okay? So I don't recommend using it. It also takes up more RAM as you use that function. It takes a lot more power to run it in render mode. So keep it in solid for the most part. But those just help with different ways to visualize objects. If we skip over a couple icons, let's go to the little one that looks like your little 3-sided axis, little multicolored axis over here. And these are settings for your on-screen widget tool, okay? So for my sphere, which by the way, if you're moving objects around on screen and stuff has gone crazy, like I can't find anything in my user perspective from moving stuff around too much. Again, you can recenter your screen around your object by hitting the / key on your keyboard over on your number pad. You can hit / to zoom in and focus on a single object that you have selected. Which can be really useful. All right. So these little editors down here by your 3D widget icon, each of these change how the widget works. Okay, so the first one that shows a blue arrow, that's for moving. That's the standard one you see active right now because there's little arrows shooting out of your axis. If you click on the little blue arc next to that, it will activate rotating controls. So it converts your 3D axis into a 3D rotator. So now you can click and drag on those different lines to constrain the rotation of your object to that axis of rotation. Or you can click on the inner white circle to click and drag to free rotate it. So that's how you can rotate things with the on-screen widget. The last one down there that looks like a line that leads into a box, this is for scaling. So click on the scale one down below. And now you've got little blocks that pop up out of your shape. So you can actually scale it on an axis to constrain it to stretch or squish the form in different directions. Or you can use the inner white circle to stretch and scale it uniformly with a sort of locked ratio. All right. Now I want to hit up 2 more menus before we call it a break here. That's just working through the 3D menu at the bottom. I don't want to really show you much more down there, but those are the pieces you'll want to know about at this stage. So let's hop up over into the right side of the screen, looking at the top. And the next little panel over here is called the Outliner panel. That's the one at the top. That looks like a sort of folder tree system with how it stores information. The Outliner panel, you can kind of also think of it as a layer section for 3D modeling. This is how it organizes and keeps up with everything you've added to your 3D scene. So you'll notice that inside of my scene, I can expand it or collapse it to show everything stored inside of it. But it shows me objects and media that I can edit in my scene in orange. And it'll highlight objects. If I select it, it highlights the text to indicate that it's an active object. But I can see details about shapes in here. I can expand on shapes or objects to see what all is stored inside that one shape. I can also manipulate on this screen the name of the layer, which again is part of what you should be doing to keep up with the organization of your file. To rename any of these, you can just double click on the name and type over it and hit return to give it a new title. So again, it's important that you rename so you keep up with stuff, because Blender just creates generic titles for everything you drop in, okay? So keep up with that. Next to each object over to the right, there is a set of 3 different icons. Each of these icons will do something different inside the interface. So one of those things that I want you to pay attention to in here, I'll give you an example with the sphere, since that's kind of visible on my screen right now. What I want to show you is these set of icons. So the first one is a little eyeball. Now, if you remember from Photoshop, the eyeball changes the visibility of a layer. So it does the same thing inside of Blender. You can click on the eyeball icon to turn off or turn on an element inside of the editing system. And that's better if you're just kind of like quickly editing other things and you don't want to see the object. You can just easily turn it off temporarily. The next little icon is an arrow. That arrow actually allows you to lock down that element inside the scene to where it cannot be edited. So if you turn off the arrow, that object cannot be changed, okay, until you turn the arrow back on. So that's really useful if you've finished editing an object and you don't want to mess with it by accident.
It's like locking it.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's a locking tool, or they call it restricting. So, whatever, floats your boat or helps you understand it, right? So you can lock it down with that. And then the last icon is a little camera. Now that little still camera, if it's turned off, it keeps your object or that element from being rendered out to a single still image whenever you use the rendering tools. So one thing to keep in mind is that if I turn this off at any point, my object still stays visible out here in the 3-dimensional space, right? So that can be problematic when you get to rendering out a still image, which you'll do at the end of the project. But if you render it and you wonder why that sphere is not showing, it's probably because the render is turned off for it, okay? So make sure that that little icon is rigged for that layer That way you'll see it when it renders it out. Other good thing to note is that if you export objects out, regardless of the render icon being turned off or the eyeball, that object will still be exported with the entire model, okay? If you don't want it to travel with the model at all, you have to delete it out of the system. And that's pretty easy to do. You just select it, and you can hit X on your keyboard to delete a model or a thing. And it'll give you a pop-up, and you have to click on Delete to confirm it. And it'll go away.
Can you say it again?
So again, if you want to delete an object, you just select the object you want to get rid of. Whether you're in the outliner, you can actually directly select the object from there, or out in your viewport. Select it, hit X on the keyboard, and then confirm it by clicking on delete or hitting return on your keyboard. And that'll get rid of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's outliner. Again, you'll want to keep up with that as you go because that thing will get filled up with objects as you proceed into the design of your piece. The last panel that I want us to look at is called properties, so that's the next one listed right below it. Properties is always denoted with this long strip of little icon images. So I'm only going to point out a few of these that I think would be important to you as far as working with the project. The first one is to look at is the object property icon, which is a orange cube. If you go to object properties, which by the way, object properties only appears if you actually have an object in your scene selected. You won't just get it for everything. But you have object properties visible because I've got a mesh selected for a sphere. And what it gives me access to that I really want to know about are the transform controls. These are the value-based controls. So these are very technical and very precise. So I can manipulate my object on each of the separate axes listed in 3D space. So I've got X for location, Y, and I can click and drag on these values, by the way, to move my object around based on that axis. Same with rotate. This is what you want to use when you're doing like precision positioning of an object or even precision scaling. See how I've got like scale controls over here as well. This is also a place where you can quickly reset like the scale or position of an object in your scene by just re-entering beginning values for these. So most of them it's set to 0 for all the locations, 0 for rotation, and then 1 for scale is the standard in Blender. And that's really all I want you to know about in the object properties. There's a bunch of stuff you can play with, but that's the one you'll want to be able to deal with for precision movements and editing. The next one that I'd like you to know about is the blue wrench icon. That's called modifiers or object modifiers. This will appear if you have an object selected in your scene. It doesn't look like much on the front end, but if you click on the button below that property that says add modifier, you'll get this giant pop-up window that looks like this. And it will give you 4 separate categories with different filtering tools. This is kind of like a 3D filtering system to use to manipulate your shape on screen in some way or another. A very basic one, like I'll just give you an example here of one that you can play with, is called Remesh, and it's under the Generate column. So I'm going to select my sphere and hit Remesh. And this is a touchy tool, so you have to be careful. Notice how you now have options to set for that modifier property that popped up. And most modifiers, there's going to be a lot of options that you can set and adjust to make changes. Some modifiers are very complex and some are very simple, like this one. This only has like 4 or 5 different slider options that you can change to make something happen on screen. That's not bad. Some require working in tandem with other features in Blender, like triggering simulations. Will require working with the physics simulator as well as modifiers. But for basics, we'll do something a little fun here. So I'm going to switch the mode. It says sharp. I'm going to go to blocks. And when you switch to blocks, what happens is that your shape is instantly converted into something that looks like a Minecraft object. Pretty fun. But it will basically convert the mesh form into a sort of blocky surface. Now, I said this thing is kind of touchy, and I mean that based on the settings below, where it says like octree depth. If you change that number, you don't want to slide on it, by the way. Don't drag your mouse on it. Try changing it incrementally, like one click at a time. So I went from a 4 to a 5 to a 6, and notice how it is basically doubling and multiplying the density of squares inside of that mesh, which by proxy is also increasing the size up here at the top. You may notice that your vertices or triangles have just increased, so mine is now a 15,000 faced object. When I jumped it up to a level 6 for the octree depth for that modifier. But if I drop it down to a 4, it's like 900 sides, 900 faces. Not bad. You can also drag the scaling tool to change the size of the squares. But you can get some very abstract results with this tool very quickly. So it's kind of fun to play with. It works great, again, with any shape besides the rectangle or the cube, okay? If you're using a cube, it's not going to make any difference because the cube is already square. So it's not going to do much with it. Now, if you like what you've done with the modifier, you can also apply it to your object permanently by hitting apply. Or if you don't like it at all, you can also delete it by hitting this little white X located in the modifier menu property. By clicking that, it'll delete the modifier altogether and remove it from your object. Another cool thing about modifiers is that you can also stack them. So you can use like multiple things together to get different effects combinations. So it's a fun tool. All right, and the last one that I want to show you in the object properties area is this little camera. This little still camera is the render menu. And if you click on the button that says render on your screen, this will actually render a preview of a still image, a full resolution still image of your scene based on what the camera inside of your scene is looking at. Now right now, my camera is only staring at the cube because I haven't done anything to the cube. It's been sitting at the center of that grid on screen the whole time. And I haven't moved my camera. Now, when you click on render, it will change your viewport instantly to this image preview port. If you want to switch it back, go down to the lower corner and locate the little icon that looks like a sunset photograph and click on that and switch it to 3D view. And you will have your viewport restored for 3D editing. So that's kind of a quick way to see a preview of your scene as you go. If you want to see like a preview of like the texture on an object or the lighting and how it affects the three-dimensional form, really great for that. I don't really want you messing with any of the other features in there right now. We'll look at those in a later exercise. But just so you're aware it's there. Okay. To finish wrapping up this demo, guys, go up to File and go to User Preferences. And I just want to show you some of these. User Preferences, again, this kind of lets you set functionality inside of Blender to your liking or your need. There's a few that I want to point out inside here. Click on the tab at the top that says Interface. And inside Interface, there are two options in here you may find useful. One of them is called Zoom to Mouse Position, under the view manipulation. And the other one is called rotate around selection. Zoom to mouse position can be very helpful because it allows you to zoom to wherever your mouse is located on screen. By default, though, it will otherwise zoom into the center of the grid plane every time. The same with the rotate around selection. If you have an object selected on screen, you can use rotate around selection to rotate around that object instead of the center of the grid plane on your screen. And you can check them if you'd like to use them or try them out. Skip over to input. And under here, you have a long list of category features inside of Blender that have hotkeys or shortcut keys set for them. So if you ever want to change out shortcut keys in Blender, you can do it. View 2D is what allows you to change the navigation tools inside Blender, inside your 2D ports or view areas. You can easily reset them to something different if you want to by clicking on where it says like left mouse, right mouse. But this also tells you how to do certain things if you want shortcuts. So kind of handy. Other thing you can notice over here on this left side menu bar inside input, there's options here for things like emulate 3D 3-button mouse. If you're working at home and you have a 3-button mouse, which is a much nicer mouse than what we have in the classroom, unfortunately, you can actually get more shortcut functionality out of Blender instantly. So if you have one of those at home and you're playing with it, it's a great tool to use. By default in this lab, I have your preference set for selecting with the left click button. But if you install it at home, it's going to have it set to right click. Okay? So just be aware of that. If you install it elsewhere, that it may work a little differently. Emulate number pad is another checkbox you can use if you're working on a laptop. It will convert your number keys on your laptop keyboard or short form keyboard into the number pad keys that change your view options. Of course, when you do stuff like that, just keep in mind that it changes any of those number key traditional shortcuts out. So you lose shortcuts somewhere. There's always a trade-off. Especially when you move to a laptop. So just keep that in mind if that applies to you. Add-ons is a great place for extending functionality in Blender. There are a host of functions that I have turned on for Blender alone for you guys in this lab that you can use. So I've turned on all kinds of crazy things. If you look under categories and click on enable or enabled, this just gives you a list of everything that I have turned on inside the Blender interface for this software up here. But each of these will extend the functionality inside the software, give you extra menus to work with, extra tools you can use to help kind of add things to the environment, either to help simplify it or to do more advanced controls. And so they have tons of these pre-installed with Blender, but to activate them you have to actually turn on like their checkboxes to make them accessible. So that's what that does. The last one I'll make note of is over on the System tab at the far end. And this one's just good for when you're working at home again, if you do. Under Compute Device, this is where you can change out the CPU or graphics card that it leverages to pull 3D visualizations on screen. So right now it's set to none on my screen, but I think by default on these computers it's set to this, which is called CUDA. CUDA is actually linked into your video card for your computer. If you have a modern graphics accelerator, this will be something that you'll see. If you don't, you may not have CUDA. It might say OpenCL, it might say OpenAL, or in very worst case, there's nothing. Your computer may not have a good graphics accelerator that Blender uses, so it may just be set to none by default, and you can only use your CPU at that point to leverage speed inside the computer. But I'm going to leave it on CUDA because that's fairly decent for operation. After that, if you've finished off everything, you can hit Save User Settings. and that will maintain your settings during your current session. And when you're done with your Blender file, you go to File, Save As. And when you get into the Save As menu screen, it looks kind of weird. But if you want to find a location to save your work to, use this little System Bookmarks section over here on the sidebar. And I recommend just going straight to desktop with that. You can also use the other one up here at the top that just goes straight to your main hard drive, the silver one under System. But desktop is more efficient because it goes straight to where you can find it. And then you can go up here and change out the title of the file. It's showing red on my screen because it detects another file of the same name in the same location, so I have to change something. But I'll just call it Untitled01. If you're working on your project exercise, you should be naming it the standard format that we've been using all semester, which is your first name, last name, spring, semester, term, and then project number, project 3. And then you can save as blend file. Click that button in the upper right. And then you should have on your desktop a Blender file that looks like this. All right, so that'll conclude kind of the first demonstration we'll do today. The second one will be a little bit shorter because we're just kind of reviewing and going in depth with some of the different editing modes inside of Blender.